The dust hung in the air like a curtain between worlds, thick and golden in the late afternoon sun that beat down on the town of Redemption Springs. It was 1882, and the town had earned its name not through any holy intervention, but because it sat at the last watering hole, before 60 miles of unforgiving desert. Men came here to wash away their sins or drown them, depending on their disposition and the weight of their conscience. Jacob Brennan stood outside the general store, his weathered hands wrapped around a sack of seed grain that had cost him 3 months of careful saving. He was 34 years old, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. The sun and wind had carved stories into his face. Stories of a homestead barely holding on, of crops that struggled in the stubborn earth, of a loneliness so profound it had become like a second skin he wore without thinking about it anymore. His ranch sat 15 miles north of town, a collection of rough, hewn buildings and fences that he'd built with his own hands after the war. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he'd sworn he'd make something of it, or die trying. He was about to mount his horse when he heard the commotion, coming from the saloon across the street. It wasn't unusual to hear raised voices and laughter spilling out of the dusty rows, but this sound was different. There was a sharp edge to it, something cruel that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jacob had learned during his years as a soldier to trust that instinct, that primitive warning that something wasn't right with the world. He tied his horse to the rail and crossed the street, his boots leaving prints in the dust that would be gone with the next wind. The batwing doors swung open as he approached, and a man stumbled out, laughing too loud, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey even from 6 feet away. Inside, the saloon was dim and close, smelling of tobacco smoke and spilled beer and unwashed bodies. A crowd had gathered near the back, and through the gaps between shoulders and hats, Jacob could see what held their attention. A girl stood on a wooden crate in the corner, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, though it was hard to tell through the dirt and exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. Her dress had once been blue, he thought, but now it was the color of dust and despair. Dark hair fell in tangled waves around her face, and her feet were bare, bloodied from walking on rough ground. But it was her eyes that stopped Jacob cold, stopped him so completely that he forgot to breathe for a moment. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and fierce, and they held a defiance that all the rope in the world couldn't bind. A fat man in a stained vest stood beside her, one hand gripping her arm hard enough to leave marks. His name was Vernon Pike, and Jacob knew him by reputation as a man who dealt in human misery the way other men dealt in cattle or dry goods. He was shouting at the crowd, his voice slick with false enthusiasm. "Come now, gentlemen, surely someone here needs a woman to cook and clean. She's young, she's strong, and she'll work hard if you've got a firm hand. Do I hear any offers?" The men in the crowd laughed and called out crude suggestions that made Jacob's jaw tighten. He'd seen enough evil during the war to last a lifetime, had watched men reduced to their worst selves when they thought no one was watching. He'd promised himself when he came back that he would never again stand silent while wrong was being done, even though keeping that promise had cost him friends and brought him trouble more times than he could count. 1 sack of grain, Jacob heard himself say, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through cloth. The crowd went quiet, turning to look at him. Pike's eyes narrowed with calculation. 1 sack, that's insulting, friend. This girl's worth at least 1 sack of good seed grain. Jacob interrupted, his voice steady. That's all I've got. You want to hold an auction, go ahead. But I'm guessing most of these men are just here for the entertainment, not the purchase. Pike's face flushed red, but his eyes darted around the room, assessing the crowd. Jacob was right. Most of them didn't have 2 coins to rub together, and the ones who did weren't interested in paying for something they figured they could have for free once Pike got desperate enough. Pike had made a mistake, trying to sell the girl in a saloon full of drunks, instead of quietly to a homesteader or rancher, who might actually have use for household help and money to pay for it. Fine, Pike spat. 1 sack of grain. But you take her as is, no refunds, no complaints. Jacob walked forward and set the heavy sack at Pike's feet. The man cut the rope binding the girl's wrists with a knife that he pulled from his belt. The blade nicked and stained with rust or worse. The girl didn't move, didn't rub her chafed wrists or show any sign that her circumstances had changed. She just stood there on that crate, her gray eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls of the saloon. "Come on," Jacob said quietly, not touching her but jerking his head toward the door. "Let's get out of here." She stepped down from the crate with a careful dignity that seemed impossible given everything she'd been through. She walked ahead of him toward the door, her bare feet moving silently across the sawdust-covered floor. The crowd parted for them, and Jacob felt their eyes like brands on his back. Outside, the clean air hit them both, and he saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath, as if she'd been holding herself together by force of will alone and could finally let go just a fraction. He led her to where his horse waited, patient and steady. The animal was a tall buckskin gelding named Dancer, though the name was ironic for such a solid, unflashy horse. Jacob untied the reins and turned to the girl. "Can you ride?" She looked at him for the first time, really looked at him, and he felt the weight of that storm, cloud gaze measuring him, seeing past his face to whatever lay beneath. After a long moment, she nodded once. He swung up into the saddle and reached down to help her up. She hesitated, then placed her small, calloused hand in his and let him pull her up behind him. She sat side saddle, her arms carefully not touching him, maintaining a distance even though they were on the same horse. They rode out of town in silence, heading north toward the open range. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a world that allowed girls to be sold in saloons. Jacob didn't push Dancer hard, mindful of the double burden and the fact that the girl behind him had probably already been through more than anyone should have to endure. After an hour, he felt her shift, and then her arms wrapped around his waist, holding on as exhaustion finally claimed its due. Her head rested against his back, and he could feel her breathing, slow and steady. He wondered when she'd last felt safe enough to sleep. The ranch appeared as the sun touched the horizon, the building's dark shapes against the dying light. It wasn't much to look at, just a small house with a covered porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a chicken coop, and a corral with 3 horses that nickered a greeting as they approached. Jacob had built it all himself, working from first light to darkness, creating something out of nothing the way his father had taught him. The land was his through a homestead claim, 160 acres that he was trying to prove up, trying to turn from dirt and prairie grass into something that could sustain a life. He dismounted and reached up to help the girl down. She slid into his arms, and for a moment they stood there, her feet on the ground but his hands still at her waist, her face level with his chest. Then she stepped back and the moment broke. "You must be hungry," he said, "and thirsty. Come inside." The house was simple, 2 rooms and a loft, but it was clean and well built. Jacob had chinked every gap, had fitted every board with care. The main room held a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, shelves with supplies, and a narrow bed in the corner. A ladder led up to the loft where he usually slept. It was a bachelor's home, sparse and functional, but it was solid and it kept out the wind and rain. He lit a lamp and gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit down. I'll get you some water and food." She sat, her hands folded in her lap, watching him as he moved around the room. He brought her a cup of water from the bucket by the door, then sliced bread and cheese and laid them on a plate in front of her. She stared at the food for a long moment, then picked up the bread with shaking hands and ate like someone who wasn't sure where her next meal would come from. Jacob busied himself at the fireplace, giving her privacy to eat. When he turned back, the plate was empty and she was watching him again with those steady gray eyes. "What's your name?" he asked, pulling out the other chair and sitting down across from her. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, and he wondered if maybe she couldn't, if whatever she'd been through had stolen her voice along with everything else. But then she spoke, her voice rough from disuse but clear. Sarah Colton. I'm Jacob Brennan. This is my place. She nodded slowly, her eyes moving around the room, taking in every detail. He could see her mind working, cataloging, preparing. For what he didn't know. I want you to understand something, Jacob said, choosing his words carefully. I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to get you away from Pike and those men in the saloon. You're not my property. You're not my slave. Come morning, if you want to leave, I'll take you wherever you want to go. But if you want to stay, you can work here. I'll pay you fair wages, give you room and board, and treat you with respect. Your choice. Sarah studied him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Why? She finally asked. Why would you do that? Jacob was quiet, thinking about how to answer. I saw things during the war, he said slowly. Bad things. Things that made me ashamed to be human. I made a promise to myself that if I survived, if I got to go home, I'd try to be better. Try to make the world a little less cruel where I could. Maybe that sounds foolish. It sounds dangerous, Sarah said. Decent men don't last long in a hard world. Maybe, Jacob agreed. But what's the point of lasting if you become something you can't live with? Something shifted in Sarah's face, some wall cracking just a little. Where do I sleep? You take the bed down here. I'll sleep in the loft. There's a bolt on the door. If you want to use it, keep me out. I'll respect that. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and he realized that this might be the first time in a long time that someone had offered her a choice, had acknowledged that her safety and comfort mattered. Thank you, she whispered. Jacob nodded and stood. I'll be up before dawn. We've got work to do, if we're going to keep this place running. But sleep as long as you need to tonight. He climbed the ladder to the loft and lay down on his bedroll, staring up at the rough wood of the roof. Below, he heard the soft sounds of Sarah moving around, then the scrape of the bolt sliding home. He smiled in the darkness. It was a start. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised them both. Sarah proved to be a tireless worker, rising with the sun to help with the animals, the garden, the endless tasks that filled a homesteader's day. She was quiet, speaking only when necessary, but her hands were always busy and her mind was sharp. She learned quickly, remembered everything, and never complained. Jacob found himself watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, seeing the way she moved with a careful efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. She was beautiful, he realized, though not in the delicate way that fine ladies in cities were beautiful. Her beauty was in the strength of her, the resilience that kept her going when most people would have broken. Slowly, carefully, she began to talk. Little things at first, comments about the weather or the chickens or the way the bread had risen. Then, gradually more. She told him she'd come west with her family 3 years ago, that they'd been farmers in Missouri trying to find better land. Her father had died of cholera the first winter, her mother and younger brother the second. She'd been left alone, barely 17, with nothing but a failing homestead and debt to the general store. Pike had bought the debt and, with it, claimed ownership of her. She'd worked in his house for a year, suffering indignity she wouldn't name, until he decided she was more trouble than she was worth and tried to sell her off. Jacob listened, his anger a cold, hard thing in his chest, but he kept his voice calm and his hands steady. You're safe here, he told her, for as long as you want to stay. One evening 6 weeks after she'd arrived, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The day's work was done, the animals fed and settled, and for a moment the world seemed almost peaceful. Sarah was mending one of Jacob's shirts, her needle moving in and out with practiced precision. Why haven't you married? She asked suddenly, not looking up from her work. A man with land, a good man, surely there were women interested. Jacob was quiet for a moment. There was someone, he said finally, before the war. Her name was Elizabeth. We were going merry when I got back, but the war changed things. Changed me. I came back harder, quieter. She wanted the boy I'd been, not the man I'd become. She married a banker from St. Louis. I don't blame her. Sarah's needle paused. Do you still love her? I don't think so. I think I love the memory of who I was when I was with her. But that person died at Shiloh or Gettysburg or one of 100 nameless fields. What came back was someone else. She nodded slowly, understanding in a way that only someone who'd also lost themselves could understand. I used to be someone else too, she said quietly. A girl who laughed and sang and believed the world was mostly good. I don't know if I can ever be her again. Maybe we're not supposed to go back, Jacob said. Maybe we're supposed to become something new. Something that can survive in this world, but still choose kindness when it matters. Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart stutter. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was possibility. It was a door opening after being barred shut. The change between them was gradual but undeniable. They worked side by side during the days, their movements synchronized without planning. They ate meals together, their conversations growing longer and more personal. Sometimes Jacob would catch Sarah smiling at something he'd said, or he'd hear her humming as she worked in the garden, and he'd feel a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer sun. He never pushed, never assumed. He treated her with a careful respect that she slowly began to trust. And in return, she began to soften. The hard edges that survival had forced her to develop smoothing out just a little. One day in late summer, a storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds piling up like mountains on the horizon. They rushed to get the animals secured, and the tools put away before the rain hit. They made it inside, just as the first drops began to fall, fat and heavy, drumming on the roof like fingers. Sarah stood at the window, watching the storm, and Jacob watched her. Lightning flashed, illuminating her profile, and thunder followed a few seconds later, shaking the house. She didn't flinch. "I love storms," she said softly. "They remind me that there are forces in the world bigger than human cruelty. That nature doesn't care about our suffering or our small evils. There's something freeing about that." Jacob moved to stand beside her. "I never thought of it that way." She turned to look at him, and in the dim light of the storm, her eyes were luminous. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for treating me like I matter. You do matter," Jacob said, and without thinking, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered against her cheek, and she leaned into his touch like a plant turning toward the sun. They stood like that for a long moment, the storm raging outside, something equally powerful but far more gentle building between them. Then Sarah rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative and brave. Jacob's arms came around her, holding her close, and the kiss deepened with a sweetness that made him ache. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was crying, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't think I could feel this again," she whispered. "Didn't think I deserved to." "You deserve every good thing this world has to offer," Jacob said fiercely, "and I'll spend every day proving that to you if you'll let me." She smiled through her tears. "I'd like that." The seasons turned. Summer faded into fall, the prairie grass going golden brown, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Jacob and Sarah worked together to prepare, harvesting what they could from the garden, storing supplies, making sure the house and barn were ready for the cold months ahead. But now they worked not as employer and employee, not even as friends, but as partners, as something more. On a crisp October evening, with the first snow threatening in the clouds overhead, Jacob asked Sarah to marry him. They were in the barn, tending to a mare that was due to foal, and the words just came out, simple and honest. "Marry me, Sarah. Build this life with me. Not because you owe me anything or because you need protection, but because we're better together than we are apart. Because when I think about the future, I can't imagine it without you in it." Sarah looked at him with those storm cloud eyes, and in them he saw everything they'd been through, everything they'd survived, and everything they were building together. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed 2 weeks later by a traveling circuit preacher who passed through Redemption Springs once a month. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church on the edge of town, with only a handful of witnesses. Sarah wore a new dress that Jacob had bought for her, the first new thing she'd owned in years, and she'd woven wildflowers into her dark hair. Jacob wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, Vernon Pike stood up from where he'd been lurking in the back row. "I object," he said loudly. "That woman is my property. I sold her labor, not her freedom. She's got 6 more years of service owed to me." The church went silent. Jacob felt Sarah's hand tighten on his, felt her start to tremble. But before he could speak, before he could move, Sarah turned to face Pike. "I owe you nothing," she said, her voice ringing clear in the quiet church. "You bought nothing but a lie you told yourself, that human beings can be owned like cattle. I've paid for my parents' debts with my sweat and my suffering. I've endured your house and your cruelty, but I'm done now. I'm done being afraid. I'm done letting men like you decide what I'm worth. So you can sit down and shut up, or you can leave, but you will not stop this wedding." Pike's face went purple with rage. He took a step forward, and Jacob moved to intercede, but the sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Hayes, who'd been sitting quietly in the front pew, stood up and put a hand on Pike's chest. "The lady made herself clear," Hayes said mildly. "And seeing as how debt bondage is illegal in this territory, I'd suggest you leave before I decide to look too closely at your business dealings." Pike glared at them all, but he could read the room. Every person in the church was staring at him with disgust or indifference, and he knew he had no allies here. He turned and stomped out, slamming the door behind him. The preacher cleared his throat. "Well then, shall we continue?" The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Jacob slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, and she placed one on his, and when the preacher told him he could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one eye in the small congregation. They rode back to the ranch together as the sun set, Sarah riding behind Jacob with her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. The world was painted in gold and purple, and everything felt new, felt possible. That winter was hard, as winters on the plains always were. The snow came early and stayed late, and there were days when they couldn't leave the house, when the wind howled like a living thing, and the cold was a knife that cut through every barrier. But inside, they were warm. They had each other, and they had the life they were building together. Sarah taught Jacob to read better, spending long evenings by lamplight, going through the few books they owned. Jacob taught Sarah to play the harmonica, though she proved to be terrible at it, and their laughter would fill the small house. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing the stories of their lives, the dreams they'd abandoned, and the new ones they were creating together. In the spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. Jacob wept when she told him, overcome with a joy so profound he had no words for it. They stood together in the garden, the earth soft and ready for planting, and made plans for the future. They would need to add onto the house, expand the barn, buy more cattle. They would build something real, something lasting. The baby came in early winter, born during a snowstorm that seemed fitting somehow. She was a girl with dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and they named her Grace because that's what she was, what they'd both been given when they'd found each other. Years passed. The ranch grew, slowly but steadily. Jacob and Sarah worked side by side, building their life piece by piece. Grace grew tall and strong, learning to ride almost before she could walk, helping with the animals and the crops. She had her mother's fierce spirit and her father's quiet strength, and watching her, Jacob would sometimes feel overwhelmed by gratitude for the life he'd been given. Sometimes people would ask them how they met, and Sarah would smile and say that Jacob had saved her. But Jacob always shook his head. "We saved each other," he would say, and Sarah would squeeze his hand because it was true. One evening, many years after that day in the saloon, Jacob and Sarah sat on their porch watching the sunset. The house was bigger now, the barn new and straight, the corrals full of good horses and cattle. 3 children played in the yard, Grace and her 2 younger brothers, their laughter carried on the warm summer breeze. "Do you remember what you saw in my eyes that day?" Sarah asked quietly. In the saloon, Jacob thought about it. Thought about that moment when he'd looked at a girl on a crate and seen something that made him act against all reason and caution. "I saw someone who refused to be broken," he said finally. "Someone who was still fighting, even when everything had been taken from them. I saw courage and strength and a spirit that wouldn't quit. I saw you." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was so angry that day, so full of rage and despair. I thought my life was over, that I'd lost everything that mattered. But then you showed up with your sack of grain and your serious face, and you gave me a choice. No one had given me a choice in so long. That was when I started to hope again." "Best trade I ever made," Jacob said, wrapping his arm around her. "One sack of grain for a lifetime of this." Sarah laughed, the sound still able to make his heart skip even after all these years. "We built something good, didn't we?" Jacob looked out at their land, at their children, at the life they'd created from nothing but determination and love. "We built something better than good," he said. "We built something true." The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and they sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who'd been broken by the world and had put each other back together, stronger in the mended places than they'd ever been whole. They'd taken their pain and their scars and transformed them into something beautiful, something that would outlast them both. And in the end, that was all anyone could hope for. To find someone who saw you at your worst and chose to stay. To build something that mattered in a world that was often cruel and always hard. To leave behind more than you took. To love and be loved in return. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jacob squeezed Sarah's hand, and she squeezed back. They didn't need words anymore. Everything that mattered was understood between them, written in the years they'd shared, in the life they'd built, in the children who carried their legacy forward. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. It was a sound that had once meant loneliness to Jacob, but now it just meant home.